Affairs, more affairs, and a secret meeting with the Pope, the love story of Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife Josephine is among the most tangled and passionate in political history. Before Napoleon Bonaparte became Emperor of France, he was an ambitious major general seeking a wealthy wife who would grant him access to another class of the French elite. Instead, he found Josephine. She was an extremely feminine woman with a tiny waist, husky voice, and careful attention to makeup, who was active in the social world of the Parisian elite. She was also known for spending large sums of money that she couldn't afford. To maintain her lavish lifestyle and care for her 2 children from a previous marriage, Josephine had a string of wealthy romantic partners and admirers. Napoleon was immediately obsessed with her, but she wasn't as impressed. Not only was he 6 years younger than her, he was also awkward and not particularly attractive. However, he was also smart, ambitious, and more than willing to provide for her. And so, in 1795, the two became lovers. In the early days of their relationship, he sent her many sexually charged letters, and his passion only grew the longer they were together. He repeatedly asked her to marry him and would fly into blind rages when she said no. They were also constantly having massive fights that were followed by passionate reconciliations.
Josephine's story is mind-blowing, really.
Although Napoleon desperately wanted to make Josephine his wife from the very beginning of their relationship, his family was against the match and made no secret of that. His brother Joseph especially mistrusted her. They may have viewed her as frivolous and promiscuous, or disapproved of the age difference. The most likely concern, however, was that she had been married before and already had 2 children. Although her family were aristocrats, they had very little money. Her first husband found her provincial, but in her relationship with Napoleon, it appeared that she would be the one who was indifferent towards her spouse. She remained emotionally distant, at least at first, and Napoleon's family ultimately never warmed to Josephine. Joseph, in particular, regularly tried to convince his brother that he should leave his wife. Although Josephine was only 6 years older than Napoleon, she had already lived a full life before she met him. There were also many other men in her sphere, and at first, he paled in comparison. When they first met, he saw her as the height of Paris society, and in some ways, he was right. Both Josephine and her first husband were imprisoned during the French Revolution. He was executed, and she was about to meet the same fate, but by coincidence, the revolution ended the day before she was going to be killed. After the Reign of Terror ended, those who had been in prison became fashionable and highly sought-after social guests. Her time in prison had taken its toll, though, and to survive on her own upon her release, she turned to her social connections. Josephine was in desperate need of money and was forced to have affairs with numerous powerful men, whom she relied on to keep her and her children alive. In comparison to the many other men in her life, Napoleon didn't seem impressive at first. He was awkward, had no sense of humor, and didn't take care of himself. Throughout her time in Paris, Josephine used her sexuality as a way to attract powerful men and keep them interested. Napoleon, on the other hand, had far less sexual experience than his new lover. While he was an extremely jealous partner who hated any man who interacted with her, he was also thrilled by her sexual prowess.
It was well known she had affairs with men in high French society.
As recounted in the book Ambition and Desire, The Dangerous Life of Josephine Bonaparte, Josephine took great care to make herself alluring to Napoleon. This included decorating her bedroom with mirrors and candles, wearing heavy perfume and makeup, and adopting an almost submissive persona. In bed, she was active and experimental, which led Napoleon to refer to her moves as zigzags. Just a few days after his wedding, Napoleon went with the army to Milan. He begged his new bride to accompany him, but she refused. While alone in Paris, she turned her attention to another man. When Napoleon heard rumors that his wife was having an affair, he returned home to confront her in person. She performatively sobbed, cowered, and even pretended to faint from fear. Overwhelmed by her emotional response, he forgave her. During his campaign in Egypt, Napoleon spoke rapturously about Josephine to anyone who would listen, but rumors that she was still unfaithful spread among his men. Finally, one of Napoleon's generals presented him with evidence in the form of a letter. He then reportedly suffered a fit and fell into a depression. Napoleon wrote a letter of his own to his brother expressing how heartbroken he was, which was captured by British forces and published in newspapers around the world. Josephine was scorned in Paris and retreated to a massive country estate. Incredibly, she continued to allow her lover to visit her there. When Napoleon heard that despite everything, she still hadn't ended the affair, he embarked on one of his own with the wife of one of his junior officers, and he made it as public as possible in the hopes of making Josephine jealous. When Napoleon finally returned to France, he was hailed as a returning champion, but his only thoughts were of Josephine. He still loved her and hoped for a reconciliation upon his arrival at her country estate. Alas, when he arrived, he found the house empty. He assumed that she was with her lover and then threatened divorce. However, most of his friends and family counseled him to use caution, but he decided to be rid of Josephine once and for all, as he ordered the household servants to get rid of all her things that he bought her and not to let her back into the house. But Josephine had actually tried to meet Napoleon on the road and had taken the wrong route. When she arrived back home, she forced her way inside. The two had a massive fight that reportedly lasted all night, but by morning they were back together.
You are nothing without me.
Their dynamic was now changed forever. Before, Napoleon had been passionately obsessed with his indifferent wife, but now he was in control of the relationship. Josephine agreed readily to his demands and became far more affectionate towards him. Napoleon, on the other hand, had many affairs and didn't bother to keep them a secret. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte became Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. Although Josephine was his wife, she had to fight to be named the Empress. His family tried to convince him that the best way to secure his future as emperor was to marry a princess. He was reportedly quite conflicted about the idea of leaving Josephine for a more politically advantageous wife. He eventually confided his internal debate to Josephine. Surprisingly, she didn't fly into a rage when he told her that he was considering leaving her. Instead, she hatched a plan to become empress. The night before Napoleon's coronation, Josephine met with Pope Pius VII and told him that they'd been married from a legal perspective, but not in a religious ceremony that would make them husband and wife in the eyes of God. Pius was horrified and insisted that he wouldn't crown Napoleon without a proper Catholic wedding. With no time to convince the Pope to change his mind, Napoleon was forced to marry his wife again and make Josephine the Empress of France. As Empress, Josephine was popular among the French people, and Napoleon believed that she brought him good luck. She often hosted foreign officials, planned celebrations, and even represented her husband at official events. However, she was unable to do the one crucial thing that was required of the emperor's wife: bear him an heir. Napoleon and Josephine tried for years to conceive without success. She effectively convinced him that since she already had 2 children from a previous marriage, he must be infertile. But in reality, it was Josephine who could no longer have children, something that she almost certainly knew. In 1806, one of Napoleon's mistresses became pregnant, and he realized that if he remarried, he could have an heir to secure his legacy. Josephine became increasingly frightened that her husband was going to leave her, or worse, that his family might have her killed. According to a letter Napoleon wrote to his brother, whenever Josephine felt sick, she became convinced that she'd been poisoned to make way for a new bride who could give Napoleon an heir. In 1809, Napoleon told Josephine that he was leaving her so that he could find a wife who could provide him with an heir. Her screams and sobs were loud enough to be heard all over the palace. His mind was made up.
You will do as you are told.
Although they'd been married for years, their separation was called an annulment. When Josephine and Pope Pius VII pushed Napoleon into a religious marriage ceremony before his coronation, they neglected to invite a parish priest. Napoleon used this excuse to push the church to rule that the marriage had been done illegally, even though it took place at the urging of the Pope. Some historians believe that Napoleon intentionally didn't include a priest so that he would be able to legally annul his marriage whenever he chose. The Emperor and Empress made their separation official at a ceremony that was bizarrely romantic, as they read statements to each other. In Napoleon's, he expressed his gratitude and ongoing devotion to his soon-to-be ex-wife and stated that he was only leaving her for the good of France. Josephine declared that allowing the divorce was the greatest proof of her love that she could offer. However, she was too overwhelmed with emotion and had to ask a servant to finish reading it aloud. The two sealed their separation with a kiss, and the marriage was officially annulled. Although she was no longer married to Napoleon, Josephine remained France's official empress and queen. She continued to live at her country estate near Paris, where she hosted visiting royalty, and Napoleon continued to support her financially. In 1814, he was forced to abdicate and sent into exile. Although her benefactor was out of power, Josephine managed to find an ally in the form of Alexander I of Russia so that her future could be secure. Then suddenly, she contracted pneumonia, which would ultimately prove fatal. In her final days, Josephine became delirious. Her servants reported that she was talking about Napoleon, occasionally saying King of Rome, the title he had given to the heir he had divorced her to have. She also reportedly said Elba, the island where her former husband had been exiled, and simply Bonaparte. Josephine's maid reported that the empress died of grief. Napoleon learned of his former wife's passing when he read it in the newspaper. He interpreted the fact that her death happened so soon after his exile as proof of her continued loyalty, and he locked himself in a dark room and refused to eat for some time.
Josephine?
So yeah, she's dead.
Despite their divorce, Napoleon remained passionate about Josephine for the rest of his life, and his feelings for her lasted long after her death. One of the first things that he did when he returned from exile was to visit Josephine's country estate. She had loved violets, and the gardens at the estate were full of them. He picked some of the flowers and placed them in a locket, which he wore for the rest of his life. When he was sent into his second exile, he kept many portraits of Josephine with him, including a collection of plates with her face on them. Just as Josephine talked about her former husband as she was dying, Napoleon is also believed to have been thinking about her on his deathbed. In fact, she may have even been his final thought. It was reported that his last words were the 3 things that mattered most to him in life: France, the army, and finally, Josephine.